My background is with the contact center solution providers, and I saw that, oh my gosh, we could really get this wrong in a big way. Started it, we realized it's much bigger of a problem that needs to be vetted out.
Welcome to Telecom Disruptors, a podcast that takes a closer look at the people and technology that is changing the way the world communicates. I'm Alan Percy, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Telco Bridges and your podcast host. And in this episode, we're checking in with Rebekah Johnson, the founder and CEO for Numeracle. So, Rebekah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, I understand since we crossed paths at SIPNOC that you've managed to land a case of the flu. So I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope you're feeling better today.
Yes, I am feeling a little bit better. So I'm happy to be on this podcast. I at least have my wits about me. I might not sound so well, though.
There we go. Anyway, so it was really good meeting you at SIPNOC. I think that's a phenomenal event. It brings together, about 100 people, combination of service providers and the vendor community, and a lot of the brain trust of what makes, what's building the next generation communication. Which is actually, in hindsight, it's actually not a lot of people that are steering the boat, if you know what I mean.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So a big topic, and of course, one of the first days of the event was all focused on, the robocall issue. And before we get started and digging into how the robocall issue is going to be dealt with, I'd love to learn a little bit about you and about your about Numeracle. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so I actually founded this company as a result of the call blocking and labeling that the carriers deployed. My background is with the contact center solution providers, and I saw that, oh my gosh, we could really get this wrong in a big way by mislabeling and blocking legal calls. So that's how I got started, and my focus at my company is really to help the legal businesses ensure their calls are not going to be labeled fraud or scam by the carriers, service providers, app solution providers, who are doing everything they can to block the illegal and unwanted calls to consumers. So we're kind of at each other, but joining in and participating, like with the SIPNOC and ADIS and all these other groups, I represent the legal enterprise side so that when service providers are deploying Shaken, we start off on the right foot, is my whole end goal here.
Yeah, that's great, because I've spent a lot of time interviewing people since midpoint of the summer, I guess. I'm probably working on robocall issue, but I mostly have talked to the service provider side of the equation. So it's good to have somebody from the other side of the equation, which is those that might be negatively affected by the robocall issue. And in fact, I wrote a little bit about after the sessions. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote a little bit about that. People are going to get snagged in this if they're not careful, right? And there's some competitive motivation in making sure that, as a service provider, that you give your customers a Shaken token as soon as possible. It's going to cause quite a bit of disruption. So, you moderated a session during that robocall track titled "Know Thy Customer." I'm curious as to where that came from and how did you get involved in that?
Right. So it comes out of this PACE association that I'm a part of, where we have a communication protection coalition. And we started talking about, when Shaken was being deployed, and, how do service providers know or attest to the calls? So it's that full attestation and partial attestation. And when we look at the full attestation, ultimately it came down to, well, you're just asking them how well they know their customer, aren't you? Mm-hmm. And that's exactly it. So there has to be some kind of framework around that the industry can follow. And so that's how I kind of got started in it. And this is a conversation that once we started it, we realized it's much bigger of a problem that needs to be vetted out from an industry perspective than just a simple, we'll just tell the service providers to do a full attestation, which if you look at Shaken, it's defined with like 2 sentences on what it is, and then partial attestation. It's not a lot of guidance on what is really behind all that. And the reason why I feel very strongly about it is my background's in privacy, security, and compliance, and I headed up getting these certifications, attestations, all of those things that are involved. That's a lot of work in order to prove really who I am to an entity that needs to know who I am. So this whole know your customer concept in the attestation is so much bigger if we're really going to do it right. It's much bigger than I think service providers could even handle. So that's how I got involved, to shed that light on it and start the conversation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So just for the listeners, just a little bit of background. So Shaken is a framework or a technology that that this next generation service providers are looking at using to put an encrypted token on the header of a call, so that when a call traverses the network and gets to the destination, that receiving service provider can then look at that token and say, aha, that the initiating service provider knows who initiated the call, and attests, and that's the attestation, that this is a valid caller. It's not being spoofed, and it's not somebody who it's somebody who meets, I guess, some criteria. And I guess that's what we're talking about today, is what's that criteria.
Yeah, that's it.
So they can display information on the recipient's phone as to whether or not this is either, a good call, thumbs up, right, green check mark, which is another whole conversation for another day, or this is a questionable call. We're not exactly sure where it came from, or this is a known spammer, and it should be blocked. So, and the challenge, I think, from my understanding from the session and from talking to you, is there are organizations, contact centers, doctors' offices, school districts, who need to be able to call people at home and not have their calls either blocked or indicated as potential spam, because they have important business to do with their customer that is critical to banking or their school safety or whatever it might be. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And to go on that point, it's really about the brands behind these calls, and that can be Delta, Walmart, CVS, Capital One, Entergy, Consensus Bureau. I mean, it's any entity that has any need to communicate with a patient, a member, a consumer. And so for those, people behind those calls, number one, they have not been made aware that their calls will need to be signed. So that's really problem number one, to ensure that they reach the end customer. That whole industry is in the dark. Mm-hmm. So when a call is not signed, like you said, that could trigger decisions by the terminating carrier to not deliver the call, which is a huge concern. And then the other element is, the attestations, which are the full, partial, or gateway. And I can tell you, no legal entity wants their call to be anything but fully attested.
Right.
So, I asked, my first question when I saw these was, who's performing the attestations? And the answer I was given was the service provider.
Right.
And I thought, oh my goodness, that is a huge burden to bear for the service providers. And I will say, since I've been involved in this space, I'm bringing that brand voice into this conversation, because they do care. And you're going to see the relationship between the brands and their service provider kind of change. I can see them starting to issue out communications to their service providers, wanting to know, what are you doing about my calls? How are you setting up to sign? What are you doing for Shaken? And I'm concerned that if they're not prepared, well, the brand, they're only going to be caring about getting their communications out, and they'll pull and go someplace else. So that's just a warning, that I want to give out to the service provider side, is the awareness is happening on the brand side. So not only is the pressure coming from the FCC, it'll come from the brands as well.
Right. Yeah, so I've been involved with SIP trunking providers and, I guess general tier 1 providers for a number of years. And I will tell you that they would happily, right now they're in a situation where they happily hand out telephones to anyone who will fog a mirror. If you can fill out an online form, you can get a telephone number. And that's the way it is today. And that's actually part of the reason why we're in this predicament that we are, is there are service providers, and they may not be tier 1 brands that we all know, but they may be, some of the either international operators or the tier 2 or tier 3 operators, who allow people to just go online and buy DID numbers or buy telephone numbers, and then those today often are the source of these illegal robocalls. And the minute the service provider figures out what's going on, they shut it down. The customer goes to another service provider. Or the perpetrator, I should say, goes to the next service provider, and they very quickly can move to another place and start to make their calls. So part of what the industry is saying is that, oh, hey, service providers, you can't just dole out these telephone numbers like chiclets like you've been doing. You need to actually know who these customers are. So that's a big business change for the service providers too, right?
It is huge. And, there's some lessons that we're learning from other industries who have had this. This is not a new challenge. The Know Your Customer actually comes from the banking industry. Whenever people want to launder money, they just go to the bank. That was the easiest one to sign up. Like you said, there are certain service providers where we can get numbers, and it's very simple. Maybe it's a click through on a website, and boom, I get my numbers. The banking industry had to change. Now, it was forced through mandate, right? So laws were put in place specifically for Know Your Customer. And then there was a shift on these entities popping up who do the evaluations of the customers, so the banks know that they're not, setting up accounts for, terrorist activities or other criminal actions. So it's not unreasonable, I think, to take the Know Your Customer and put it into this space, because when we're dealing with the number one U.S. consumer complaint and the amount of fraud that happens on this channel, it's just reached that point in time where we have to put this in place. So it gives an opportunity for the legal enterprises to raise their hand, because anybody who's legal, they're going to answer all the questions and give you all the information you need. Right. So that's not a problem for them. But the illegal ones are not going to want to do that. So it could create a whole new underground world that gets developed, but at least for the current environment, this is the right next step. But we just got to put the right framework around it so that we don't overburden the legal service providers who really want to do the right thing, and for the legal entities who are going to make use of this channel.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, matter of fact, I actually walked away from some of that, some of the sessions at SIPNOC, sort of scratching my head saying, are we inadvertently creating a whole new black market for attested telephone numbers? And I wrote a little bit about that in my blog, titled a little section that had, hey buddy, want to buy a telephone number? Guy in a trench coats, right? So I guess the trick is is create an incentive structure for the service providers to make sure that they are only doling out shaken tokens, right? And an attestation to customers they genuinely know, and they know the business model, and are watching the traffic on them. Yep. So it's interesting. So I'm curious as to, how can someone learn more about your initiatives at Numeracle and the space of enterprises and businesses that are concerned about making sure that as the shaking gets implemented through 2019, that they're represented.
Yeah, so there's two ways to address that. First, number one is get active and involved in the definition and defining of Know Your Customer, and that would come through the Communication Protection Coalition underneath the PACE Association. I head that group, and that's where we are talking on a quarterly basis, defining what Know Your Customer looks like. We are building the framework for it, and we need input from the service providers on, what is acceptable, what would be expected of the service providers to be able to kind of check off that list of, if I do these things, this qualifies as a Know Your Customer process. And so if you don't participate in it, then you're just going to have to accept what gets pushed down. So that would be number one, get involved, and I'm the person that you would reach out to plug you into those groups. Number two, from my company's perspective, I look at things from the Know Your Customer for the enterprise. So I'm already defining what that world looks like for the enterprise and wanting to leverage what they do today. And this is where I lean on my expertise in that privacy, security, and compliance realm. And I strongly and firmly believe that what they do today should be leveraged and extended down to the service provider as almost like a checklist. So if they have had certain evaluations that they've already done, as in like brick and mortar walkthroughs that they spent 6 figures on, I think that qualifies for know your customer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that a questionnaire from the service provider is going to give you anything more than what that is. So I would love to work with service providers as well. We've already got a bank of clients where I've done the evaluation and the certification of that entity. And so there's no question about whether or not they're legal. I've even had some companies try to come through me who are not, and they don't make it through my process. So I'm not a company that you can just sign up. And that's what you're going to have to get to. And I think that my prediction is the service providers, this is too much of a burden for them to bear. They need to be focused on what they do best. And there will be other companies who step up and do that evaluation for them. So, but yeah, that's all. It's active, it's moving, but I do care about the burden on them, and I'm trying to solve that as well.
Yeah, it's a good, very interesting. I think it'll be interesting to watch this unfold. And one of the takeaways from this last SIPNOC is that the FCC, the CRTC have made it very, very clear they need to see the shaken framework implemented in by the end of 2019, and which means that this other infrastructure needs to come together fairly quickly. Yeah. So probably the word to the wise would be get moving if you're one of these organizations, and step forward. And probably the effort of many together is probably more effective than trying to go it alone. I think that's the strategy, right?
I agree 100%. Yes.
Good. All right. Well, listen, Rebekah, I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. It was fantastic hearing about what you've been working on. And great to hear the other side of the conversation, too, instead of just the service provider side.
Absolutely. Anytime.
All right. Excellent. So with that, a couple of last reminders. If you'd like to share your thoughts or comments, please feel free to reach out at LND Percy on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you, and, of course, appreciate the follow. And there's all kinds of great content that we publish on a bi-weekly basis on blog.telcobridges.com. Make sure you subscribe there and ensure you don't miss any of the latest details. And with that, I'd like to thank you, our listeners, and look forward to having you join us on another episode. Have a great day. If you like what you heard, be sure to click on subscribe to hear more episodes.